What I'm trying to figure out right here is where the silicone pieces will be cut. I always want 2 pieces of silicone, let's call them front and back since that's usually the arrangement I go for. I always want 2 pieces of silicone for every piece that is going to get cast. Usually a sculpture will require some amount of splitting. Rarely are you going to find a piece that only requires 2 pieces of silicone. Well, unless it's a portrait. They tend to turn out this way, but we rarely find that this ends up working when dealing with more complex sculptures, like a full figure, which is what we're dealing with here. I want to be able to visualize where this splitting is going to take place. I want to see it. Visualizing is going to help me place this cut in silicone in the right place. I'm not going to simply cut the silicone. I'm going to build a wall that comes off the surface of the silicone, and that wall is then going to be cut in half when we open our mold. The placement of this wall is crucial because if it's poorly placed, then I might run into issues when it comes to taking the mold off. The way I'm going to visualize the placement of the wall is by using small clay dots placed in a line across the surface of my sculpture. These clay dots work much better than another solution, which could be drawing on the silicone surface, because they are raised up from the surface. You can also move them around really easily, while anything that's going to draw on silicone is probably going to be hard to erase. Now, the fact that they're raised off the surface means I can observe them from a distance, and it's easy for me to tell whether or not they are placed wrong. So what does wrong mean? In order to understand this, let's simplify the shape that we are looking at, the shape that we are casting, into a sphere, a ball. Now, instead of imagining that we are looking at a 3-dimensional sphere, we're going to pretend it's 2-dimensional. Even though we know it's 3-dimensional, we're going to look at it and treat it as a 2-dimensional object for now, even though we know it's a sphere. The clay dots, which are markers for where we want our silicone wall to be built, should sit right at the apex of that sphere. This means that if we were to push the clay dots further away from us, the clay dots would disappear behind the horizon of the sphere. We would no longer be able to see them. If we place them over the apex of the form when we're looking at it and thinking of it in a 2-dimensional fashion. What we would create when doing so is an undercut, and we want to avoid undercuts as best as we can. Now, the silicone is flexible, and that means that we have some leeway when it comes to undercuts. It doesn't have to be perfectly placed. The wall doesn't have to be perfectly placed for the silicone to come off. But you have to remember that we are going to have a hard mother-mold jacket on top of the silicone later, which will support our floppy silicone. And this hard shell does not flex. So in that sense, we are planning for the future here. If we have undercuts and we build our mother mold, we are going to essentially lock the mother mold onto our sculpture. We won't be able to take the mold apart. We'll have to break it apart. And that could be really bad. You could damage your sculpture, and you're definitely going to damage your mold. So it's not a good place to find yourself in. So we're going to do our best to avoid that. Now, in order for this to work, you have to have a clear conception of the direction you want the mother mold shell to come off in later. In the same direction you plan the mother mold shell to come off, you need to step back from your work in this same direction and observe if you can see all the clay dots that you've placed. If you can't see them, you have an undercut, and you should reconsider the placement of the clay dots. The clay dots, and therefore the silicone wall, should be placed at the apex of the form perpendicular to the direction you are planning the mother mold to come off in. Deciding on the direction the mother mold should come off in is perhaps a little bit less complicated than it seems. In general, find a direction with the least amount of undercuts, as the body is wider and shallower when looking at the front and the back, as compared to when looking at the side, where it is narrower and deeper. The front and the back are going to have much less undercuts by default and will leave you with a shallower mold, which is easier to cast in and to get off a hard casting as well. So we will use the front and the back as the directions we are trying to get the model mold off in and adjust as we need from there. Because I want easy access inside my mold, and because a really long mold is trouble usually, I'm going to separate the upper and lower half of the mold as well. There will be a cut right along the waist of my figure. A silicone wall will mark this cut, just as silicone walls mark every other cut I will make. The armature pole entering into the hips of my figure is going to be enclosed inside this wall. And this is good because it means that the pole is not buried inside the model mold or in the middle of a silicone piece. Because of the position of the legs, the balance leg is in front of the stand leg. I have to switch what I treat as the front here, which I can do really easily because the upper and lower half of my mold is separate from each other. Another good reason to do this practice. If I treated the front, the direction the model mold is to come off in, the same on the bottom as I did on the top, then the stand leg would be trapped behind the balance leg and the mold wouldn't come off. In order to solve this, I turn what I consider the front, or the direction the model mold is going to come off in, slightly to the side. And in this way, nothing sits behind something else, and we are going to be able to take the mold off easy peasy. You do want to consider upper and lower half separately, and always try to imagine taking the mold off your sculpture. Would the hard shell of the model mold get trapped anywhere? If it would, you need to reconsider what you are doing and come up with a different plan. So while all this is true, we do have an issue that we have to actually fix with the model mold in our upper half. As you can see here, the head is slightly turned to the side in my sculpture, and in doing so it blocks some of our clay dots. An option could have been to rotate the clay dots, or what we treated as the front of the model mold, so they were perpendicular to the front of the face, but that leaves us with a host of other issues in other places, and I think would likely have created more problems for us than it would have solved. Another consideration to make apart from how the mold is going to open is where the seam lines are placed. Where we build the wall and cut the silicone open, we are going to have lines in our casting essentially, and we want to avoid having these lines travel through areas of high detail like the front of the face if at all possible. We can certainly repair these lines, but if they run through areas with a lot of detail, that work is much more difficult. The solution here is actually pretty simple. Once I reach a point where there's no way to solve my issue with the placement of my silicone wall, or if I try to solve my issue with the placement of my silicone wall, I simply get more issues, I resort to solving my issues by splitting the model mold instead. The model mold shell can be split by building two separate model mold pieces and then bolting them together so that they function as one. When the mold is to be taken apart, we can unscrew the bolts and the model mold comes off. When we need to cast in the mold, we can bolt the model mold pieces together and they will function as one monolithic piece. And of course, our one silicone piece in the front is going to be able to flex around that head no problem, because the silicone is flexible. Now I know from experience that this is the best option for when the head is slightly turned and blocks the shoulder like this. And now so do you. Notice how both halves of our model mold is going to have zero undercuts here.